My name is Ruthanne Delgado. I am 37 years old, and I work as a postal service supervisor in Flagstaff, Arizona. 3 weeks after my husband's grandmother publicly removed my 9-year-old son from a family photograph and announced in front of everyone that he didn't count because he wasn't biological, I sat down at a folding table at that same family's next gathering and slid a certified genealogy report across the surface toward her. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I simply waited for her to read what was on the first page and watched the room go completely silent. Before I tell you the rest of this story, let me welcome you to this channel, a place where ordinary women face situations inside their own families that would bring most people to their knees, and come through the other side not through anger or retaliation, but through patience, documentation, and the kind of quiet truth that speaks louder than any argument ever could. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. Let me know in the comments where you're watching this from. And if you want to see more videos like this, please subscribe to this channel. I want to start at the beginning, because the beginning matters. I grew up in Tucson, the second of 4 kids in a family that didn't have a lot of money, but had a great deal of warmth. My mother was a school librarian, and my father drove long-haul trucks, which meant he was gone for stretches at a time. But when he was home, he was entirely home, present in a way that made up for the absences. I learned early that family wasn't defined by perfect circumstances. It was defined by who showed up, consistently. I met my husband Gerald at a work conference in Phoenix when I was 28. He was an accountant for a regional firm, steady and thoughtful. The kind of man who remembered small details he mentioned in passing and brought them back up weeks later to show he'd been listening. We dated for 2 years and were married in a small outdoor ceremony in Sedona, just close family and a handful of friends, the kind of wedding where everyone actually talked to each other instead of just posing for pictures. My son, Marcus, came into our lives through adoption when he was 14 months old. Gerald and I had been trying to start a family for over a year without success, and when our social worker placed Marcus in my arms for the first time, I understood immediately and completely that the path we had taken was the right one and the only one I ever wanted. Marcus was born with moderate bilateral hearing loss, and by the time he was 3, he had hearing aids and was learning American Sign Language alongside spoken English with a fluency that still amazes me. He is funny, fierce, deeply curious about how machines work, and has his father's habit of listening carefully before he speaks. Gerald's family was large and spread out across northern Arizona, with branches in Flagstaff, Williams, and a few cousins further south near Globe. His parents, Harold and Diane, were good people who welcomed Marcus from the start without hesitation or condition. They came to his adoption finalization hearing and cried the same kind of happy tears Gerald and I did, and they had framed photos of Marcus on their walls, the same way they had framed photos of every other grandchild. I loved them for that, sincerely and without reservation. Gerald's grandmother, however, was a different matter entirely. Her name was Loretta, and she was 81 years old, sharp-tongued, and possessed of the particular confidence that comes from having been the unchallenged center of a large family for several decades. She had opinions about everything, delivered them freely and without apology, and had a way of making disagreement feel like personal disloyalty. Most of the family had long ago learned to simply nod along, change the subject, or leave the room when Loretta got going on something she felt strongly about. I noticed the first warning sign at Christmas, 2 years before the reunion, when Marcus was 7. Loretta had brought wrapped gifts for every grandchild and great-grandchild, distributed them loudly and lovingly, and then looked at Marcus's empty hands and said with genuine puzzlement rather than cruelty that she hadn't known he would be there. Gerald's mother, Diane, covered quickly by giving Marcus one of the extra gifts she always kept wrapped in the car for exactly this kind of situation, and Loretta moved on without another word. Gerald and I exchanged a look across the room. We didn't say anything that night. We told ourselves it was an oversight, that Loretta was getting older, that she hadn't meant anything by it. The second warning sign came the following Easter, when the family gathered at Harold and Diane's house for a backyard lunch. Someone brought out a camera to take a group photo, and when everyone arranged themselves on the back porch steps, Loretta called out to Marcus to come stand with her specifically, which seemed kind until I noticed, watching from the side, that she placed him just off the edge of the frame, and then told the photographer they were ready. It was so subtle that I genuinely wasn't certain I had seen what I thought I saw, and Marcus didn't seem to notice either, focused as he always was on whatever interesting thing had caught his attention nearby. But I noticed, and that time I took out my phone and took my own photo of where everyone was standing before the official picture was taken, the kind of quiet reflex that I couldn't have explained to anyone in that moment, but that some part of me clearly already understood was important. By the time summer arrived and the family reunion was announced, Marcus had just turned 9 and was heading into 4th grade. He was excited about the reunion in a way that made my heart swell and ache at the same time. Talking about the cousins he wanted to see, asking if there would be a swimming pool, wondering if he could show his uncle the model airplane he'd been building in his room. He packed his own overnight bag, carefully, the night before we left, tucking his hearing aid case into the front pocket, the way I had taught him. The reunion was held at a rented property outside of Williams, a wide property with a covered pavilion, a stretch of grass, and enough picnic tables for the 60-some-odd people who came. The day started well. Marcus found his cousins within minutes of arriving and disappeared into a running game that crossed the whole length of the grass. Gerald's parents were relaxed and happy. The food was abundant and good, the kind of spread that takes 3 families working together since the night before to pull off. It was late afternoon, the golden kind of light that makes everything look like a memory while it's still happening, when someone called everyone together for the family photograph. A cousin had set up a proper camera on a tripod, and people were arranging themselves in rows in front of the pavilion, the tallest in back, the children in front, Loretta placed at the center of it all, as she always was at these things. Gerald found me and pulled me over, and I reached for Marcus's hand, and the 4 of us walked toward the group together. What happened next took less than 30 seconds. Loretta looked at Marcus, looked at the arrangement of the group, and then said, loudly enough that at least a dozen people heard it clearly, that Marcus should step out of the photo, that the family picture was for family, and that he didn't count because he wasn't a real Delgado. Marcus heard every word. I know he did, because I was holding his hand and I felt it. I want to tell you exactly what I did in that moment, because I think it matters more than anything else in this story. I did not cry. I did not argue with Loretta in front of 60 people and a 9-year-old boy who was already looking up at me to understand what his face was supposed to do next. I did not let Gerald step forward and make it worse by saying something in anger that would give Loretta the upper hand in every retelling of this story for the next decade. I crouched down to Marcus's level, right there in front of everyone, and I signed to him quickly and clearly that we were going to go get some lemonade together and find the best seat to watch the photo from. I told him in a low voice that I was proud of him and that I loved him and that we were going to be just fine. He looked at me for a long moment with those steady brown eyes of his, and then he nodded, and we walked away from the group together, hand in hand, without rushing, without looking back. Gerald stayed for the photo. I asked him to later, and he said he hadn't known what to do, which I understood, even if part of me wished he had followed us. The photo was taken. People laughed and adjusted and called out to each other, the way people do at reunions, as if nothing had just happened in the middle of them. Loretta sat in the center of the image, surrounded by every Delgado who was there that day, and my son's face was not in it. We drove home that evening mostly in silence. Marcus fell asleep in the back seat before we even reached the highway, the way kids do after a day of running in sun, and Gerald kept his eyes on the road and his hands tight on the wheel. When we got home and Marcus was in bed, Gerald sat at the kitchen table and said he was sorry, and I could hear how much he meant it, the genuine weight of it. I told him I wasn't angry at him. I told him I needed a few days to think, and that when I was ready, I would tell him exactly what I wanted to do. I spent those days doing 2 things. The first was paying close attention to Marcus, watching for signs that what had happened was sitting on him in a way he couldn't process, the way 9-year-olds sometimes carry hurt they don't have words for yet. He was quieter than usual for a couple of days, and one evening he asked me, while we were doing dishes together, if it was bad that he was adopted. I set down the glass I was holding and turned to face him, and told him that being adopted was one of the most deliberate, chosen, intentional things a family could do. That every single child born into a family arrives without anyone choosing it, but that his father and I had chosen him specifically him, out of every possibility in the world, and that no one could ever take that away from him or from us. He thought about this for a moment, and then said okay, and went back to drying his plate. And I held myself together until he went upstairs. The second thing I was doing during those days was research. Not emotional research. Not the kind where you spiral into everything that's wrong with a situation. Methodical research. The kind I was trained for through years of supervising a postal district, where precision and documentation were the difference between a process that worked and one that didn't. I started with what I knew about Loretta, which was limited, and I started building outward from there. Gerald's family had always spoken of Loretta as the absolute foundation of the Delgado line in Arizona, the original trunk of the family tree, the woman who had raised her children and watched her grandchildren be born, and always positioned herself as the keeper of what was real and what was Delgado. She talked about bloodlines the way some people talk about property, as something owned and protected and passed only to those who deserved it. What I did not know, and what I began to suspect only after I started pulling on threads that the family had never thought to examine, was whether Loretta's own story was as solid as she had always presented it. Gerald had mentioned once, years ago, almost as a throwaway detail, that Loretta had been raised by her father's second wife after her birth mother passed away when she was an infant. I had filed that detail away without much thought at the time. Now I return to it. I began with public records, Arizona's vital records system, the state archives, ancestry databases that cross-reference census data, and adoption court filings from the early and mid-20th century. I was methodical about it, the way I am about everything, working in the evenings after Marcus was in bed, keeping a folder on my laptop where I saved every document I pulled, every name I cross-referenced, every date I verified against another source. I wasn't looking to expose anyone. I was looking for truth, and I was following it wherever it led. It took me 11 days to find what I was looking for, and when I found it, I sat very still at my desk for a long time before I let myself fully absorb what I was reading. Loretta had not been raised by her father's second wife in the casual, informal sense that the family seemed to believe. There was a legal record, filed in Maricopa County in 1948, when Loretta was 6 years old. It was a formal adoption decree. Her birth name had been different. Her biological father was listed, and his last name was not Delgado. The man who had adopted her, her father's second wife's husband, was Delgado. Loretta had taken that name through legal adoption, the same process, the same paperwork, the same binding legal act that had made Marcus a Delgado, the day his adoption was finalized in a Flagstaff courtroom 9 years ago. She was adopted. Loretta herself was adopted. The woman who had stood in front of 60 family members and declared that my son didn't count because he wasn't biological had herself become a Delgado through exactly the same means she had used to erase him from that photograph. I requested a certified copy of the adoption decree through the proper channels. I also obtained a certified genealogy report from a professional genealogical research service, a legitimate, accredited organization that compiled the full documented family history with source citations for every claim. I paid for it with my own money, and I waited for it to arrive. And when it did, I read through every page twice before I put it in a manila envelope and set it on my desk. I did not tell Gerald what I had found, not yet, because I needed to be certain of something first. I needed to be certain that my motivation for what I was about to do was not anger, not the desire to humiliate an 81-year-old woman in front of her family, not revenge dressed up as justice. I sat with what I had found for 3 more days, asking myself honestly whether I was doing this for Marcus or for myself, and whether the outcome I wanted was one that would genuinely help him understand his place in this family, or simply one that would make Loretta feel as small as she had made him feel. The answer, when I finally arrived at it, was this. I was doing it for Marcus, and I was doing it because the logic Loretta had used to exclude him was false on its face, and she deserved to know that. And so did every person who had stood in that field and said nothing while a 9-year-old boy was walked away from the family photograph by his mother's steady hand.
I told Gerald on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after the reunion, the night before I planned to act. I sat him down at our kitchen table, and I placed the manila envelope between us, and I told him I needed him to look at something with me before I told him what I intended to do with it. Gerald was quiet while I walked him through everything: the adoption decree, the genealogy report, the documented evidence that his grandmother had become a Delgado through the exact same legal process she had used as a reason to exclude Marcus from a family photograph. He read every page slowly. I watched his expression move through several things at once: surprise, recognition, something that looked almost like relief, and then something more complicated underneath all of it that I understood without needing him to name it. He had grown up his entire life being told that Loretta was the root of everything, the original and unquestionable source of the Delgado name in their branch of the family. Finding out that she had carried a secret this large, for this long, without anyone in the family ever knowing or asking, was not a small thing to absorb. When he finished reading, he closed the envelope and set it down gently, the way you set down something fragile, and he looked at me and said he didn't know. I told him I knew he didn't know. None of them had known, and that was not anyone's fault, except possibly the people who had chosen to keep it quiet across generations. I told him I wasn't planning to use this to destroy his grandmother, or to rewrite his family's history out of spite. I was planning to present it calmly and factually at the next family gathering, which happened to be a birthday lunch for Gerald's aunt scheduled for the following afternoon at Harold and Diane's house. Gerald asked me one question. He asked if I was sure. Not whether I had the right, not whether the information was accurate, not whether it was fair. He asked if I was sure, which I understood to mean something deeper. Whether I had thought about all the ways this could land, all the people it might affect beyond Loretta herself, whether I was prepared for what came after. I told him yes. I told him I had been sitting with this for 3 weeks, and that I was as sure as I had ever been of anything, and that the only thing I was not willing to do was let Marcus grow up believing that a woman's careless cruelty had any basis in fact. Gerald nodded. He didn't try to talk me out of it, and he didn't offer to do it for me, which I would not have wanted. He simply asked what he could do, and I told him he could make sure Marcus was comfortable and occupied with his cousins when the moment came, so that what happened at the adult table stayed at the adult table, at least for now. Marcus was 9. There would be a time when he was older to tell him everything. That time was not tomorrow afternoon. I want to tell you about the morning of the lunch because the morning mattered to me in ways that are hard to explain. I woke up early, before my alarm, and I lay in bed for a few minutes, listening to the house. Marcus was still asleep. Gerald was still asleep. The neighborhood outside was quiet in the particular way that Flagstaff is quiet on a summer morning before the heat settles in, dry and still, and almost holding its breath. I thought about my mother, the school librarian who had taught me that the most powerful thing you could do in a room was no more than the person trying to dismiss you. I thought about Marcus packing his overnight bag with his hearing aid case in the front pocket, careful and deliberate, trusting that the world he was walking into was one where he was wanted. I made coffee, I showered, I put on a dress I felt steady in, a deep blue one I had bought for a work conference 2 years ago. I put the manila envelope in my bag, and I drove my family to Gerald's parents' house. The gathering was smaller than the reunion, about 20 people, close family only, gathered for Gerald's Aunt Patricia's 65th birthday. There were folding chairs and a long table set up in Harold and Diane's backyard, the same yard where I had watched Loretta arrange Marcus just outside the frame of a photograph 2 years earlier. There was a birthday cake with too many candles and not enough frosting, and someone had made a pasta salad that everyone pretended was better than it was. It was the kind of afternoon that would have been entirely ordinary if I had not been sitting at one end of the table with a manila envelope on my lap and something to say. Loretta was there, seated near the center of the table, the way she always was, holding court with 2 of her daughters-in-law, telling a story about something that had happened at her church that had everyone within earshot performing the appropriate laughter at the appropriate intervals. She had not spoken to me since the reunion. She had not called to apologize, had not sent a message through Gerald's parents, had not acknowledged in any way that anything had happened. As far as Loretta was concerned, I believed the matter was simply closed, filed away under the category of things she had said that nobody had challenged and therefore did not require revisiting. I waited until the birthday cake had been served and the candles blown out and the small chaos of dessert had settled into the slower, more relaxed rhythm of people sitting back with their plates. I waited until the children, including Marcus, had drifted away from the table toward the yard with the particular purposefulness of kids who have finished eating and identified somewhere better to be. I waited until the table felt settled and unhurried, the way a room feels when everyone believes the important part of the afternoon is already behind them. Then I took the manila envelope out of my bag and set it on the table in front of me, and I said, in a clear and even voice, that I had something I wanted to share with the family, a piece of family history I had come across while doing some research over the past few weeks, and that I thought everyone at this table would find it genuinely interesting. Loretta looked at the envelope. Her expression did not change right away, but her eyes sharpened in the way that 81 years of navigating rooms had trained them to, reading the situation, reading me, trying to calculate what I was holding before I opened it. I opened it. I slid the certified genealogy report out first, and I passed it to Harold, who was sitting closest to me, and I asked him to pass it around the table so everyone could see it. Then I slid out the certified copy of the adoption decree, and I set it on the table where it was visible, and I said, without raising my voice above the same calm, conversational tone I had been using since I began, that 3 weeks ago at our family reunion, Loretta had announced in front of 60 people that Marcus did not count as a Delgado because he was not biological. I said I had spent the time since then looking into the family's history, because I believed that if biological connection was truly the standard by which this family measured belonging, then everyone at this table deserved to understand that standard fully and accurately. And then I told them what the document showed. The table went quiet in a way that I had not quite anticipated. Not the sharp, reactive silence of a room where someone has just said something shocking, but a slower, deeper kind of quiet, the kind that spreads outward from a center the way water moves when something heavy is dropped into it. I watched it reach Harold first, then Diane, then Patricia, then the others, one face at a time, as the genealogy report moved around the table and people began reading what was on the pages in front of them. I explained it simply and without drama. I said that Loretta had been born under a different surname, that her biological father was not a Delgado, and that the man who had raised her and given her the Delgado name had done so through a formal legal adoption filed in Maricopa County in 1948 when Loretta was 6 years old. I said that the certified copy of that adoption decree was on the table for anyone who wanted to read it. I said that I was not presenting this information to cause harm or to rewrite anyone's sense of who they were. I was presenting it because 3 weeks ago, a standard had been stated out loud at a family gathering, and I believe that standard deserved to be applied consistently or reconsidered entirely. I did not look at Loretta while I was speaking. I looked at the table generally, at the documents, at Harold, who was reading carefully with his reading glasses pushed down his nose. When I finished, I folded my hands in my lap and waited, and the quiet continued for another few seconds that felt considerably longer than they were. Loretta spoke first. Her voice, when it came, was different from her usual tone, smaller somehow, and more careful, as if she was picking each word individually before she placed it. She said she had not thought about it in those terms, that her adoption had simply always been a part of her history that the family did not discuss, that her father, the man who had raised her, was the only father she had ever known or wanted, and that she had never considered herself anything other than a Delgado, because that was what she had been raised to be, and what she had always believed herself to be.
I let her finish. I did not interrupt, and I did not press.
because what she was saying was true, and I understood it. And I had not come to this table to take that truth away from her. When she was done, I said, quietly, that I understood completely. That the man who raised you is your father. That the name you were given through adoption is yours, fully and legally and without question. That the family you grow up inside of is your family, not because of biology, but because of history and presence, and the 1,000 ordinary moments that make a person belong somewhere. I paused for just a moment, and then I said that this was exactly what I believed about Marcus. The silence that followed that sentence was the most important silence of the afternoon. It was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of a room full of people arriving at the same place at the same time, following a path that had been laid out clearly enough that no one could pretend they had gotten lost along the way. Harold took his glasses off and set them on the table. Diane reached across and put her hand over mine, briefly, without saying anything. Patricia, whose birthday it was, looked at Loretta for a long moment, with an expression I could not entirely read, but that contained something that looked like long overdue recognition of something she had perhaps suspected, but never named. Several of the cousins and aunts around the table were reading the genealogy report in the careful, absorbed way that people read things they genuinely did not know before, turning pages quietly and glancing at one another. Loretta sat very still for what felt like a long time. She was not crying, and she was not visibly angry, and she was not preparing to argue, which surprised me more than any of those other responses would have. She looked, more than anything, like someone who had just watched the ground she had stood on for 81 years shift slightly beneath her feet, not crumble, not disappear, but shift, enough to require a new kind of standing. She looked at me, finally, and said that she owed Marcus an apology. She did not say she owed me one, which I noticed, but which I also chose to let go of in that moment, because what she had said was enough, and because I understood that for a woman of her age and disposition, saying those words at all in front of this many people had required something that did not come easily to her. I told her Marcus would appreciate hearing that, and that when she was ready, she would have the chance to say it to him directly, and that I would not make it harder than it needed to be. In the weeks that followed, the changes were small and real and grounded, which is exactly the kind of change I had hoped for. Loretta called our house 10 days after the birthday lunch and asked to speak with Marcus. I handed him the phone and went into the other room and let them talk for 11 minutes, which I know because I checked the call time afterward, not from suspicion, but from the same quiet habit of documentation that had carried me through the previous 3 weeks. When Marcus came to find me afterward, he said his great-grandma had told him she was sorry for what she said at the reunion, and that he was a real Delgado, and that she wanted him to be in the next family photo. He told me this in a matter-of-matter tone, the way 9-year-olds often deliver information that would make adults cry, and then he went back to his model airplane. I stood in the hallway for a moment by myself, and let out a long, slow breath. The genealogy report itself became something unexpected inside the family. Once the initial shock had settled, several of Gerald's relatives became genuinely curious about the broader family history it had opened up, the branches they hadn't traced, the names they hadn't known, the story of who the Delgados actually were across generations, and what that story looked like when you documented it honestly, rather than protecting a version of it. Harold started his own research project, methodically, the way retired men sometimes pour themselves into something, with the patience they didn't have when they were working. He told me at Thanksgiving that he considered me the one who had started it, and that he was grateful. Loretta attended the next family gathering, a small one at our house in Flagstaff in October, and she sat at the table without incident, and Marcus sat beside her, and at one point I watched her show him something on her phone, an old photograph of herself as a young woman, and I watched him lean in to look at it with the focused curiosity he brings to everything, and I thought that this, exactly this, was what I had been working toward. Not punishment, not victory, just a table where everyone who belonged at it was allowed to sit. What I learned through all of this is something I already believed, but now know in a way that is written into my bones. The truth does not need to be delivered with anger to be effective. It does not need to wound in order to correct. When you carry it patiently, document it carefully, and present it without malice, it has a power that no amount of shouting can match, because it cannot be argued away, and it does not leave anyone with a reason to dismiss you. I did not fight for my son by tearing anyone down. I fought for him by making the truth impossible to ignore, and in the end, that was more than enough. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, and let me know in the comments where you're watching this from. If you want to see more interesting videos like this, please subscribe to this channel. And thank you so much for watching the whole video.